Part 4 of the Race Ethnicity Stratification chapter is another socio-historical overview of the major racial ethnic groups in America. Unlike Part 3, where we discuss the majority group and Native Americans and African Americans, in this part we are going to be discussing the minority groups that are primarily considered immigrant groups, and that would be Hispanic Latinos, Asian American Pacific Islanders, and then we will also be adding to our major minority groups additional kind of overview of Middle Eastern Arab Americans. And so, in order to start this chapter, because all three of these groups, unlike Native Americans and African Americans, which are not predominantly immigrant groups, we're going to be starting this presentation off with a discussion of just a really quick discussion of immigration. So, even though we are the land of immigrants, it's worth noting that we have historically been ambivalent, if not downright hostile, to immigration, really beginning as early as the 1800s. America started to exhibit some clear xenophobic signs indicating that some immigrants were more or less welcome than others. And we codified that, basically made those preferences for some immigrants from certain countries more so than immigrants in other countries during the early 1920s, where we passed the national origin system. We created the national origin system. This was basically a quota system that set into place specific quotas for immigrants to be admitted based on the country that they came from. Under this system, there were no quotas set aside from countries in Latin America, Africa, or Asian countries. So really, this was just a system that established immigration for people of European descent, really only, and then just kind of rank ordering, the countries in Europe that we preferred immigrants to come from, and these were primarily like your Western European countries, the countries that best simulated the WASP core, and then less with the kind of Eastern European countries, as well as the kind of Catholic or countries or Jewish immigrants from countries. And so this system, which is worth noting, we really didn't have a fully, a regulated immigration system up until this point. Before this, when people say they immigrated to America in the right way, in the 1800s, that really just means they got here, they got deloused either at Ellis Island or later, out west in San Francisco, but there wasn't a governmental system that really regulated who we allowed in. Before, it pretty much was as if you can pay your way to get here, and then once you are here, pay your taxes and behave accordingly. There wasn't much of an immigration system in place. So the national origin system was really that first unified system that America put out there, and it made it really clear that they were primarily only interested in immigrants of European descent, and then even so, some European countries more so than others. And this system was largely the system that was in place until 1964. So for 40 years, this was the system that we had. And in 1964, with the Hart-Celler Act, they basically passed, they abolished that quota system, and then they established the beginning versions of the systems that we have now, where we granted immigration no longer based on country, but largely kind of based on two goals, one of which to reunite families, and the other of which to kind of protect and bolster the American labor market. And the graph that you just see here just shows over recent times, how in general, in the last couple of years, these recent debates that we've had over immigration, this isn't new. Historically, the view in America has always been that immigration should either be decreased or at the very least kept at its in current level. There has not been a lot of support for increasing immigration as far back as even the 80s. So, what does immigration look like now? The ceiling that we set is 675,000 permanent immigrants each year. Obviously, there can be less. The goal is, to not necessarily have more. Um, and, this only applies to people that kind of follow the correct steps and go about this the right way. So just know that when the debate is kind of raging about what to do with undocumented immigrants, part of the issue is if you've been here in America undocumented, we don't really have a pathway for you to get back on the path to then becoming a legal citizen. So of these 675, we set aside 480 for family preference and 140,000 for employment related. Increasingly, those employment related ones have been STEM, engineering, and more professional jobs. Previously, they had been things related more to agricultural and other kind of lower menial labor needs. In addition to that 675, we also accept refugees, and refugees, they have a different process for presenting themselves, where really they do just show up at our borders, declare themselves a refugee. Previous administrations had ceilings as high as 110. This current administration has a ceiling of 30,000. And once again, like I said before, just because that's your ceiling doesn't mean that you have to accept that many. So last year we accepted roughly only half of that number. Once someone is admitted and as a refugee, and they go through that process, they become a lawful permanent resident after 1 year, and then they become eligible for the same citizenship process, which we call naturalization, as immigrants who enter in lawfully through work and family visas. So with these permanent the permanent resident status, you can apply for citizenship in 5 years, and that can be cut down to 3 years if you have a U.S. spouse. There is some specific criteria that you have to meet. I give you a link there. It is costly, and it becomes a little bit more costly every couple of years. The current fee for an adult applicant is $640 plus an $85 biometric fee, so it's $725 total. And you need to be able to pay that in full at the time that you file. Once your application is filed, how long it takes for you to then become approved to become a U.S. citizen varies by person and location. Anywhere from 5 to 8 months, kind of depending on whether or not you live in an area that has a well-staffed naturalization office, immigration office, and how many immigrants are currently applying to become citizens in your area. There have been times in our country in areas that have heavy immigrant populations, people would have to wait up to 2 years to become a United States citizen between filing and when they finally are able to come in. Once you are called in, you are able to come in, and you in addition to answering some questions, you have to be able to pass a citizenship test. I give you a link there to the study materials. Please know that with the study materials, kind of like my test, it's multiple choice, but in reality, the citizenship test is open ended. So you have to memorize these answers. You have to also pass a speaking and writing, test, say the pledge. And if for whatever reason you don't pass this, then, you basically have to start over. So it is not nearly the straightforward process that it used to be. So while there is something to be said of wanting people to do it the right way, it is apples and oranges comparisons to compare this process that we have now versus the process that we had really any time in this country before the 1920s, because there wasn't really much of a system in place. So when we think about the groups that are predominantly immigrant based, or we oftentimes assume that Hispanic and Latinos are kind of predominantly in this group, but it is worth noting that this group is a mixture of what we call immigrant populations, but then also colonized populations similar to Native Americans. And we'll talk about why that is in a second. But first, just to kind of distinguish between why Hispanic, Latino, and then also Latina or Latinx. So Hispanic is about language. It includes all pretty much all those countries that you see with the addition of Spain, but it doesn't include Brazil, because Brazil is not predominantly a Spanish speaking country. Latino is about geography, so think Latin America. It includes all those countries you see in the middle, as well as Brazil, but not necessarily Spain. And in addition, the growing use of Latinx is to kind of offer a gender neutral term to describe the entire population versus the gendered Latino, Latina. It's a fairly recent development in language there. So we had already discussed kind of the primary geographic origins of Latinos in the U.S., noting that our largest group does come from Mexico, over two-thirds. But this additional pie graph also just kind of shows that at least in 2010, where were they located in the United States. And so you can see that California has a little over a quarter, and then Texas comes in right at right under 20%. And then Florida and New York are kind of the next largest states that have the next largest Latino population, and then the rest of the states are distributed accordingly. So we oftentimes think of this group, we talk about it like all groups as a racial ethnic group, right? So this sense of you have share a culture, or a cultural element, but also there are some shared physical characteristics. And for this group, maybe even more so than African Americans, although there is a lot of skin diversity, skin tone diversity in African Americans, because they can come from so many countries. Latinos, they range from being very fair to darker skin, and we call this a color gradient. And the census, if you recall, while they ask about Latino as an ethnicity, the hope is, or the hope was, that they would then classify themselves racially, largely based on phenotype. But as I noted in a previous presentation, it's not necessarily playing out this way. And it's worth noting that even these terms, Hispanic, Latino, they don't necessarily reflect how groups themselves describe themselves. The As you can see on that chart, most of the sub-ethnicities describe themselves using their origin term, meaning they don't necessarily say I'm Hispanic Latino as likely as they are to say I'm Dominican, I'm Mexican, I'm Puerto Rican. And this is always the danger with what we call pan-ethnicities, where you have a group that we measure as an ethnic group, but that's kind of an umbrella category, and under that category they have a bunch of individual ethnicities, largely related to their nation of origin and the different cultures there. And so the Latinx community is an example of a pan ethnicity, and it's the only group we measure as an ethnicity. But it's worth noting that oftentimes individuals themselves still largely think of themselves in their nation of origin terms more so than this label. This is a group that, as discussed in a previous presentation, is going to see a good deal of growth in the future, and a lot of that growth is going to be related to natural increase because their population is currently so young, and then also the expectation that they will have children, and that it is going to be these births that are going to drive the growth of this population in our country, much more so than immigration. So, we are going to just kind of briefly touch on those primary three groups that I discussed previously. Not going to spend a lot of time here because I kind of talked about a lot of this information when I was explaining why we separate these groups out on the census. Cuban Americans, they entered America in a uniquely different way than most of the other Latinx groups, and then they adapted to society, U.S. society, in a very different way than certainly Mexican Americans and Puerto Rican Americans. And so the fact that they are largely, especially when compared to other groups, other Latinx groups doing well across multiple socioeconomic criteria reflects that the educational and economic resources that they brought with them to the U.S. and kind of how they were favorably received, at least the first two waves were favorably received. It does not necessarily, they developed an ethnic enclave. They weren't the first group to do this, but if you have been to South Florida, you might certainly be well aware that this is still a very thriving ethnic enclave of Cuban Americans to this day. Their success has generated a certain level of prejudice and resentment against them, compared to most of the other kind of racial ethnic minority groups where usually it's the opposite. It's their lack of success, and lack of mobility and lack of resources that sometimes generates majority group prejudice, and stigma. Um, so for Puerto Ricans, they became a U.S. territory after the Spanish American War of 1898. They are citizens. They've been citizens since 1917, but in 1948, they switched from being considered what we call a colony, to a commonwealth. You can see that there is a kind of distinction between the Puerto Ricans who are here in America versus the ones on the mainland. The ones who are here in America are younger. They are more likely to be educated. They're less likely, to live in poverty. But that being said, this group does still have higher than average poverty rates, higher than average incarceration rates. So they are potentially doing better than their comparison to the Puerto Ricans back in Puerto Rico, but are certainly not at parity with kind of the majority group. And then we have Mexican Americans, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time here on their history because this is the group, unlike Puerto Ricans and even unlike, and especially unlike Cubans, than any of the other Hispanic Latino sub-ethnicities. This group, Mexican Americans, we consider to be an example of a colonized group, although Puerto Rico also counts as a colonized group as well. So why do we consider it such? And it's because when the U.S. annexed and occupied Texas, which, it's presented, if you watch the Battle of the Alamo, the Disney version of that, it was seen as, of course, that America was right in their desire to kind of expand, and that Mexicans were, presented as villains here. But in reality, this really was just just a matter of settlers in Texas taking it upon themselves to decide that they should be able to live there despite that land not belonging to the United States, setting up settlements, not obeying when the Mexican government asked them to leave. The United States government decided to not intervene when the Mexican government asked them to intervene. And then when violence broke out, it became a whole war. And so the United States won that war. And at the time, as the war was going badly for Mexico, towards the end of the war, they passed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the treaty had several terms, and it was in that treaty that America received Texas as well as New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California, so most of the Southwest, which at that point, of course, belonged to Mexico. And the trade off being for the Mexican government that they would be able to maintain all the other land, south of that, what is still Mexico to this day. Although it is there are writings and letters from presidents and Congress people at that time that suggest that America wasn't sure if it wanted all of Mexico anyway, because they did not necessarily see that that land was beneficial in terms of farmland, and there was some concern about absorbing that many people that did not fit the WASP core and would never in their minds fit the WASP core. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, kind of established the boundaries. But then there were special provisions in that said, these lands that we are giving you have been in some of these families for generations. And what we ask is that you allow these people to remain on these lands, and that if you try to buy it from them, that you buy it for a fair price, but you certainly don't force them out. But you also don't necessarily force them to become citizens of the United States if they don't want to. Like, you allow them to live there on their lands, pay taxes on it, but they don't necessarily have to go, be considered as citizens of the U.S. And the United States agreed to this treaty. So our first Mexican Americans in America were these Mexicans who literally, with the signing of a treaty, found themselves now living on land that overnight had become America. And so, unsurprisingly, America did not necessarily live up to the promises of the treaty. The colonized Mexican Americans were not citizens, but they also were not necessarily treated fairly or as equals to the majority group. There was a lot of violence. Texas, in particular, was one of those areas where, in addition to lynching African Americans, there was also a good deal of lynching of Mexican Americans. There was prejudice. These Southwest countries, if you can recall, when I went over anti-miscegenation laws, these were some of the states where they passed those laws, not just against white and black intermarriage, but against white and Mexican intermarriage. And just in general, there was stigmas and prejudices. And so this kind of started, this was just the beginning of a history of that really can just be described as circular migration and rather ambivalent policies towards this specific group of people. When we were going through the Great Depression, we had the repatriation of Mexican Americans, and repatriation basically is sending people back to their country. But what's key here is that a lot of the people that were repatriated during this time period, and the main goal behind this was to kind of the country was struggling with the Great Depression, and it was really just to free up some resources and to get some people out of the country. And so if your family, if you were Mexican American, if your family was targeted, you were normally given a warning, and you were given sometimes as little as a couple of days to gather your things and leave the country, because we, America, did not keep track of how many Mexican Americans we repatriated, and Mexico kept not the best records of this. The estimate here is 400,000 to 2 million. And of that number, it's estimated based on age that about 60% of them were Mexican Americans. They were actual Americans who were born here in America. And so when we repatriated those Mexicans, this is also how a lot of land was freed up, largely for whites in the Southwest to kind of take over at that time. So when this happened, obviously this did not do well. This did not help the relationship between America and Mexico. But then within about 10, 15 years, we needed Mexicans again, because we instituted the Bracero Program, which means manual laborer. And these were just a set of laws and diplomatic agreements that began in 1942. And the main goal here was to bring there were labor shortages in America during World War II, because so many of the men, of course, were off fighting. And even with women entering the labor force, we were experiencing an economic boom, as we were building so many war-related factories and industries. And so it was set up that Mexican guest workers were supposed to come into America and help work these jobs, and they did. And so it was kind of our first massive guest worker program. The idea behind this program was not necessarily that they were supposed to stay permanently. The idea was that they were supposed to be temporary workers and then return to Mexico. And it's worth noting that a lot of them did. They wanted to. They took their wages. They took their wages that they had earned, and they returned. But certainly not all of them did. And so shortly thereafter, once the war was over, we had the kind of first like massive immigration, targeted immigration kind of law enforcement initiative that was called Operation Wetback. That was actually the name of it. And this occurred in 1954 under President Eisenhower. And it was as many as 1.3 million people were basically deported and sent back to Mexico. And though a lot of them were in fact undocumented, they were Bracero workers who had kind of overstayed. Once again, of course, just kind of because people had started to have families and have children, certainly there were younger people that were sent back at this time who were American citizens. And so all of this, of course, just kind of complicates, and certainly complicates the current immigration debates that have existed in the last 10 years or so around Mexican Americans, especially if you're thinking about in the Southwest, where that land and people's work on that land has kind of been this very circular process, or cyclical of Mexican Americans being allowed in and out of the country. But then sometimes allowed in, but then in other times pushed out. And so there these debates that we are currently having around immigration, I would just like to point out, are not very new in that sense, in that capacity. Now, Asian American Pacific Islanders, unless you're talking about the native Hawaiians on Hawaii, otherwise, this group is largely purely an immigrant group. And they are, relatively speaking, a smaller fraction of the total U.S. population at only 5%, but they have steadily grown, and it's expected that they are going to continue to grow. Now, I mentioned in the presentation on the census that unlike Latinos, where a lot of their growth is going to be by natural increase, so immigration policy really won't have that dramatic of an impact because a good deal of the increase of the Asian Pacific Islander group is related to immigration, whether or not they are at 10% or maybe 8% or maybe 7% in 2050 does have a lot to do with, our relationships with their countries of origin and what changes we might make to our immigration policies in the next, 15, 20 years. Similar to the Latinx population, this is a pan-ethnic label. This is a pan-ethnic group. And there are so many AAPI sub-ethnicities. And unlike Hispanics, they don't even share a language. They to an extent share a landmass, but certainly there are some countries that are not necessarily the Pacific Islands, that we can't even necessarily say that about. They have very long histories that predate them coming to America. And they have their own kind of unique histories and tensions with one another. And I certainly cannot do that justice in a short presentation. So I'm going to highlight two of the earlier groups that were here in America. Just because they have some kind of important historical events and policies in their past. So, and those are the Chinese and the Japanese. So, for the Chinese, they immigration first began in the mid 1800s, first to Hawaii, where they helped work the rice farms, but then later to California, and they were especially drawn by the railroad as well as mining. And they were successful there. They did face prejudice, and they did set up their own ethnic enclaves. But they did enjoy a certain amount of economic success. And then kind of the pushback from the majority group began. So they definitely had laws passed against them, anti-miscegenation laws, which meant that they were unable to marry outside of their race. And there were some areas that did not, that practiced de jure segregation, right? Did not allow them to rent there or eat there or did not hire them. But this kind of xenophobia kind of reached its peak during the 1880s with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which you can see that's actually a newspaper from that time, and that was the headline that they had. So this was the first time that because this is before we even established the quotas under the National Origins Act. This is the first time that we passed a bill, a law, explicitly saying we won't accept immigrants from this group. Because keep in mind, we did not really have a systematic immigration process. So we were basically like, we won't accept immigrants from China. And so what this literally, and no exceptions. And so what literally happened here is this is why we have a delayed second generation of Chinese in this country. There were young men who came here to work the railroads and work on the mining, and with the hopes that they would be bringing over their wives or girlfriends and start families. And literally what happened is they found themselves kind of unable to bring over any family members after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. And then they were unable, of course, to intermarry because of the anti miscegenation laws. And so this was a generation of almost bachelors. And so, for people that track these kind of population trends, like, so we literally see a leveling out of Chinese Americans during this time because they are unable to reproduce and to kind of grow themselves as a community. When the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, this is when immigration from Japan was largely opened up, and 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 they were meant to replace the Chinese to some extent with the railroad, that type of work. But even immigration from Japan was then limited in 1907 with something called the Gentleman's Agreement, which was kind of an informal agreement between the President of the United States and the Emperor of Japan, that basically said that the United States would not do to Japan what it did to China. Basically, they would not codify into law that they would restrict immigration from Japan, but that would be because Japan itself would not allow people to immigrate to Japan, with some exceptions being made, of course, for women whose husbands were already there. So, for that reason, unlike the Chinese, where there was a delayed second generation, there was a thriving generation of Japanese Americans, Americans of Japanese descent, who were full citizens because they were born here in America, as we were going into World War II. And that's part of what makes the World War II internment and the property confiscation of Japanese Americans kind of so horrendous in retrospect, is because, this wasn't even just an immigrant population. At this point, these were people that were born and raised in America. So, Japanese internment began in 1942 and lasted throughout the course of the war through 1946. And basically, signs were posted primarily in the state of California, but really just anywhere that there were Japanese. Significant Japanese populations along the West Coast, with the exception of Hawaii, which actually, interestingly enough, had the largest Japanese American populations. But because it was such a large part of the Hawaiian population, they were like, literally, if we interned them, our whole economy would break down. So instead, if you were Japanese American in Hawaii, you just lived under martial law. But along the rest of the West Coast, after concerns, after Pearl Harbor, there were concerns that the Japanese that lived in America were working in conjunction with Japan to plan further attacks. And the kind of quality of this intelligence has been called into question in modern times, but back then, they went with it, and they posted signs, and I gave you an example of what that sign looks like. Basically saying all persons of Japanese ancestry are given 2 to 5 days notice to dispose of their homes and property and report to the camps, right? So literally given 2 to 5 days to sell, secure your homes, your businesses. You were allowed a certain amount of luggage, or of belongings to go with you to the camps, and that was it. And this resulted in about 120,000 Japanese Americans being detained in these camps, and the camps were located in the middle of the country. Very similar, and that's a picture of one of them that you see there. Very similar to the reservations that we had placed Native Americans on. Of that 120,000, 80,000 were United States citizens. So these were largely people who had been born here. And 40,000 of them were younger than 19 years of age. So they were largely children. And so the estimate of, how much property did these people lose, as their civil rights were kind of, being violated, it is $400 million. And once again, this kind of like race riots, kind of like lynchings, kind of like repatriation raids. These are the dirty secrets that America doesn't like to talk about, because $400 million worth of property isn't just magically lost. Somebody gained it. People bought homes at a steal. People bought businesses, took over businesses that had previously belonged to Japanese Americans, for next to no money. And we certainly know that acquiring this property strengthened the kind of middle class social mobility, largely of the majority group, just kind of based on who was living in California and doing well at that time. But this isn't something that's really discussed. People spent 3 to 4 years in camps. This is the only group that's really truly received reparations in this country. 40 years later, President Ronald Reagan apologized to the living survivors and offered them reparations. So to this day, Asian Americans, AAPI is the kind of one minority group that, in terms of most socioeconomic characteristics, except for maybe like social status, and political power, but certainly in terms of education, income, home ownership, small business ownership, they have achieved at levels that match, if not exceed, the dominant group. And so, because of this, they're often sometimes viewed as what is called model minorities. Like, this is how you other minorities should behave. This is what you should aspire to. And it's this idea that they are successful, affluent, highly educated people that don't suffer from the problems usually associated with minority group status. This is a good example of how even a positive stereotype is still a stereotype and, still is potentially harmful. Not only does this model minority kind of label create tension between AAPI groups and other minority groups, it also makes it harder for specific AAPI sub-ethnicities, like I talked about previously, the Cambodians, the Laotians, that are not necessarily doing as well. And they're not doing as well because, unlike most AAPIs that are immigrants who come on work or on education visas, and so they're coming in with more educational and economic resources than the typical immigrant. And we actually call those types of immigrants human capital immigrants versus manual labor immigrants. So unlike those types of immigrants, Cambodians and Laotians are much more likely to be refugees, which means they aren't coming in with anything. And if you come in America and you don't come in with anything, well, you find yourself struggling like any other group that's having to work itself up the stratification ladder. And so, this is and just still the kind of constant stigma of being assumed to being what is called a perpetual foreigner. That sense that, where are you really from, is a question that oftentimes Asian Americans get. This idea that even though they are successful, they are still uniquely different and separate from the kind of majority dominant group still exist. And it just raises this point that in sociology we talk about there's this thin line between, like blaming the victim versus praising the victim. And the key word there still just being the idea that there is still some victim status of being a racial ethnic minority. Even if in this particular subgroup, it's not necessarily related to socioeconomic status. So the final group is a group that I'll call Arab Americans. The designation that they almost received on the census was MENA, Middle Eastern North African Americans, so whichever one you prefer. We got our first wave in the 1880s, and it continued until after World War II. A lot of our early immigrants were from Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Iraq. Although we don't associate the model minority label with this group as much as we do with the AAPI, in terms of educational achievement, income achievement, they are oftentimes higher than the general population. You can see that there. But once again, where they still are clearly a minority group is related to things related to social status, prejudice, and stigma. And for this group, as discussed in a previous presentation, all of this was intensified and increased after 9/11. So first, just to clarify, where do Middle Arab Americans come from? And you can see all of those countries there in the green are countries that traditionally spoke Arabic. And it's not just Middle Eastern, which, the Middle Eastern countries are part of this group, but there are other countries that extend beyond the Middle East. And so this is once again, a pan-ethnic group that has a lot of diversity. They arrived in America at different points. Where they settled in America was different. And maybe most importantly, they also have different religions. And I say maybe most importantly for that one is because we have this tendency in America to conflate Arab with an ethnicity with a religion, which is Muslim. But as you can see here, this is not necessarily true. The one pie chart shows that of Arab Americans, the actual largest religious affiliation is Catholic at 35%, and then Muslim at 24%, and you'll see some other religions related there. And then, although we might associate Muslims with people of Arab descent, actually South Asians, there's a large Muslim population that are South Asian descent, and then of African Americans, 25% of people that identify as Muslim in this country are actually that. And so you should not treat these terms interchangeably. But yet we do. And so this just gives you some more information about the Arab population. It's fairly small. And and they're pretty widely dispersed. They are most concentrated in 5 states, of which California, New York, and Michigan have the highest concentration. They tend to form minority enclaves, and as I already noted, they are once again a highly performing minority group in terms of income and education. So that is it in regards to the socio-historical overviews of all of the major groups. The final part of this presentation is very short, just kind of goes over where do we go from here in terms of race relations.